Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video here in 2025. I'm calling it the Summer Split. It's technically the Summer Split. I know it's like rounds 3 through 4 or whatever the actual title is called because the LCK format is very, very strange, and we'll talk about the format at least a little bit here in the intro because it's much different than every other region, but, you know, all things considered, this is the Summer Split. This is the Worlds qualifying split here in the LCK. And that obviously matters a lot, not only because Worlds qualification is really important to these teams, and I think doing well domestically really shows which orgs have taken that improvement and which orgs maybe have not taken that improvement, but because if you make Worlds out of the LCK, there's a pretty good shot you could actually win the whole tournament. So, you know, it's one of those things where we're really going to be getting to see a lot of the best teams in the world go head-to-head regularly in the LCK. I'm excited. I know you guys are excited as well, so let me know down in the comment section below what you expect to see out of the LCK this year. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Are you higher or lower on anybody that I talk about, any team, any player, anything like that throughout this video? I'm very curious to know where you guys land on those issues, but without further ado, let's actually get into the content itself. We've already posted a couple of primers on this channel, the NACL one over in North America and the LPL one because they have already kicked off their summer split. But if you haven't watched either of those videos yet or any of the primers that we've posted in the past on the LCK or any of the other regions that we cover, the format in today's video, we are going to go from number 10 in my power rankings to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about every single team, giving you playstyle expectations, floors, ceilings in terms of the kinds of production you can expect from those teams, and also, of course, talking about, you know, where they stand in the format as well now, because records do carry over from the spring split going into summer, at least as far as I'm aware. You start with your record in spring, so it really does matter how you did in spring to even give yourself a chance going into the rest of the split. We will be ranking every single team. We will also be ranking every single player within their own position from number 1 to number 10. So we'll be talking about my number 1 top laner, my number 10 top laner, all of that stuff. There are a few caveats that I always have to get out of the way at the beginning. First and foremost, the biggest one possible. This is just my opinion. I know you guys sometimes get really frustrated with my opinion because it doesn't always line up with yours. That's how opinions work. You know, I'm going to differ from you on a lot of the things that are going to be talked about in today's video, and that's totally fine. Obviously, I have a channel kind of backlog that showcases why I have the opinion on players that I personally do, but I might put a lot of stock into some of the tape that we've seen previously. I might put less stock into certain players, whether or not I think they're going to be able to rebound or perhaps, you know, bounce back or even do worse than they did in the previous split for one reason or another. I'll kind of talk about all of those individual things as we go along, but it really is just my opinion, and I'm happy to know what yours is down in the comment section below, where you think I'm too high and where you think I'm too low. Of course, there are some, you know, very specific caveats to give. You can be pretty flexible with my grading scale, with my ranking scale. If you have a player at number 5 and I put them at number 7, we're probably not all that far off, especially in terms of some positions just being better than others. Support in the LCK is ridiculously good. It's very deep. It's a position with a lot of really good players that would be number 1 or number 2 in terms of their grade roles in a lot of other positions, but end up at number 4 in support because there's so many good top tier supports. And you can say kind of the opposite thing for something like top lane. Even mid lane, which has always been super good in the LCK, is very weak in the bottom half of the standings right now. And so not every position is created equally, but by that same measure, you know, not every number is created equally. So if you see, you know, 2 players with a 5, one as a support, one as a mid laner, that doesn't mean they're the same grade just because they have the same number. That should be obvious, again, because not every position is created equally. And again, that also kind of plays into the idea that players are pretty flexible. You know, you can go up or down, I would say 1 or 2 spots, really in any position, whether that be for a team or a player, and I would be perfectly fine with that ranking. If I have a player at 5 and you have them at 7, or if I have a player at 7 and you have them at 5 or whatever, it's probably fine. We probably have very similar views on the player. It just ended up kind of grading out like that. I think that there is a lot of room to grow and potentially to fall for these players throughout the split, as we've already seen so far in 2025. We'll kind of go over how these players have adjusted across this year so far, but those are the big caveats, you know, that we have to get out of the way at the beginning of the video. So now that we've done our preamble, let's go ahead and get into our first team, and that means starting with number 10 in my power rankings, the team I have last, and this is no surprise. This is the worst team in the LCK as of right now, and honestly, with the way that their record is looking, I would be shocked if they ended anything other than 10th place in the LCK. It's the DN Freecs coming in at number 10 for me. And it's for all the reasons that you already know. This team has been an absolute disaster so far in 2025. This is one of those jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none teams that have completely collapsed, very similar to other teams of a similar ilk in the past, where it's like you got a bunch of players who were good, like mediocre in their roles, somewhere around number 5 to number 7 in terms of where they were, positionally going into the year, and all of them got worse because they don't have a star on the team. They have absolutely nobody that they can give actual resources to who will carry them games. And, we'll quickly talk about what you see up on your screen. I've already talked about this in the other primers, and so I'll be quick for those of you who have already watched it. But of course, the team name at the top with the power ranking number next to them, in this case, number 10. In parentheses, it will show how that has changed from the spring split primer to the summer split primer. Not the end of spring, but the beginning of spring. I think that's a more apt comparison because if it was the end of spring, not a lot really would have changed from the end of spring. But it just goes to show where I personally power rank the team. It shows their spring finish, which again is very important because of the format that we have for rounds 3 through 5 here in the LCK. DNF obviously get 10th place. They went 1-17 in series score, 8-35 in game score, and they are a part of the Rise group. This gives me a chance to talk about the format at least a little bit. There are 2 groups here, the Legend group and the Rise group. They're split into 5 teams each, and the way this plays out is exactly what you think it would be. It's all the teams in each group playing every other team in their own group. I believe it's triple round robin, so they play each team 3 times, and then based on that, the top 2 teams from the Legend group, which is the top group, end up getting the bye in round number 1 for the playoffs. 3 and 4 in Legend group end up making playoffs, but being in round 1, and then 5 from Legend group and the top 2 teams from, or the top 3 teams, I should say, from Rise group end up playing it out for those final 2 playoff spots. So if you're in Rise, you technically still can make playoffs, you still can push forward. It's just going to be a bit more difficult because you can't guarantee yourself a playoff spot no matter how well you do in the regular season. You still have to be able to perform in the quote-unquote play-in stage to be able to make your way there. So that's kind of how the Legend group and the Rise group end up breaking down. Of course, bottom 5 teams are in the Rise group from the spring split. Top 5 groups are in the Legend group. You can see every player listed from each starting team that will go across here, across the middle of the screen, and the numbers below them is where I personally rank them in their own positions. Again, in parentheses, that's how that's changed from the spring primer to now. There are some interesting things to go over when it comes to a lot of these teams, but again, we'll get into that on a team-by-team basis. The DN Freecs are a disaster, and they're a disaster in a lot of different ways, so let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Life at support. First thing to note when it comes to this starting roster, this is a lineup that is ripe for changes and for switching players out and trying to figure out, just exactly what they want to do. Pungyan already came in and played quite a bit in the mid lane. He was a disaster for this team, was one of the worst players in the LCK during his small tenure, although he did play a lot of the other good mid laners, which is not necessarily a great place to be. We've seen players like Void come in and start to play some jungle games, but overall, this roster is subject to change, and that's because this lineup is bad. Like, they have done nothing but underperform. All of these players have regressed, and quite frankly, all of them have continued to regress. A lot of them showed regression tendencies even going into before 2025, and I think a lot of them just kind of continued on that curve. So we'll talk about the players that at least I'm high on a little bit first and foremost, some reasons to potentially be excited about DNF and, give some hope that they could at least be better in Rise group than they were facing off against the actual good teams in the LCK super regularly across the spring split. But the one player that actually has shown, some level of competency pretty regularly over the course of this year has been Berserker in the bot lane, of course, coming back over from North America. He was kind of looked at as somebody you didn't really know what you were going to get out of in 2025. You didn't know what kind of form he was going to be in. His last year in NA wasn't as good as his first couple of years in NA on Cloud9, and obviously, North America doesn't have the best reputation in the world, but I was pretty high on Berserker coming into the year. I thought he could be a top 5 AD carry in the LCK. AD carry is another position that's really good. ADC and support, bot lanes in general are very good in the LCK, and I think Berserker has been a pretty good AD carry, all things considered. I think that there are times, especially towards the end of spring, where it's clear that the guy was incredibly tilted, incredibly mentally broken because the rest of his team was constantly running it, and so he was starting to make some mistakes. I think that's very fixable. It didn't necessarily seem like they were built mistakes into his own game plan. It just kind of felt like the result of circumstance rather than an actual problem with Berserker, which gives me a lot of confidence that he's going to be fine from an individual perspective moving forward. Now, do I think that translates to 2025? Probably not, because the rest of this team is still pretty horrible, but if you're looking for an upside for DNF, I think Berserker is an LCK caliber AD carry, and I think that's probably the best thing you can say about this team. because everybody else is, you know, all intents and purposes, a disaster. I think we'll talk about BRION, Bulldog, and Life in a minute because they've just been unplayable, but you still have Dudu here in the top lane, and while he has also been pretty terrible, this is at least someone who wasn't quite on the super big regression train before going into 2025. I do think he was worse in 2024 than he was in 2023. Never a great way to go, but he was awesome in 2022 and 2023. It really felt like even on these bad teams, he was constantly generating resources for himself, getting leads, and then just not being able to close out games because it's hard to carry out of the top lane. And it felt like he was finally surrounded with more talent than maybe he was expected to have, you know, going into the year. And that just didn't pan out, right? BRION and, you know, Berserker and Life, like, it just didn't work. Like, the DN Freecs team didn't work. But Dudu has been a part of the problem, and I think it's especially surprising because lane swaps are much less prevalent, at least, like, being a top laner that has to lane into a 2v1 bot lane, like, it's less prevalent. It still happens, but it's less prevalent than it was at the beginning of the year, and Dudu was a player that I thought was really going to benefit from a lot of those changes with how good of a laner he was previously. It's just not happened. He's had a pretty tremendously terrible year. Perhaps he figures something out. He's been really good in the summer split in the past, and again, now you're only facing off against weaker top laners. Maybe, you know, that mechanical ceiling that we saw where he could be like a borderline all-pro caliber top laner from a production standpoint, maybe that's still there somewhere. We just have yet to see it in 2025. And then you get to the three players that I have ranked last in terms of their position groups, BRION, Bulldog, and Life. We'll start with BRION because it's the easiest conversation to have. He's the lowest graded player I have in the LCK. I think he is the weakest player right now in the entire league. I think he was unplayable throughout spring. I think he was pretty much unplayable throughout winter. And I don't think he was very good last year as well when he came back from Team Liquid. This guy is cooked. Like, I just don't really know what else to say. He is not making any positive plays. He's not been a positive under any circumstance for DNF. I just don't really see the reason to continue playing him. This team is already bad. They're already looking towards the future, and BRION doesn't necessarily fit into that game plan, and he's actively making your team lose games right now. There's just no reason for him to still be playing in the LCK, and that's coming from somebody who is a big BRION fan, who was a huge fan of his back in like 2021, 2022 when he won Worlds, right? Like, I was going on record on this channel saying he's my favorite player to watch in the world during that time, but like at this point, it's just clear this guy is not an LCK caliber player. He should not be playing in the LCK, and that's as much as I'll say about that. Bulldog is a player in the mid lane who has continuously regressed throughout his entire career. He came in the best version of him that he has ever been, which is really disappointing, but he came in as 17, 18-year-old rookie, you know, really showed a lot of mechanical upside and showed a really aggressive, like, mentality that I think could translate into being a very capable mid laner at this level if he continued to grow, and all that's happened since then is that aggressive mentality has shifted into a much more passive mentality, much more of a shove and roam type of mentality rather than trying to win 1v1, and he's not very good at that style, but he's gone further and further and further into that idea, and now he's just a bad laner who's not very good at roaming. Like, he's just not a good mid lane player. He's gotten worse and worse every single split he's played in the LCK. I've been pretty vocal that I'm very much anti this DN Freecs like training staff and, you know, their coaching in terms of just the way that their player development has gone. It's clear that this organization has a problem in terms of actually being able to make players better, and that's a huge issue because look at Bulldog. Bulldog should not be the worst mid laner in the league after being kind of a pseudo breakout star a couple of years ago and looking like somebody that was really going to be interesting, but that's just what's happened here. He's completely fallen off a cliff, and at this point, I don't even know if it's worth playing him. Like, was he better than Pyongyang? Yes, but like Pyongyang was horrible, and so like what does Bulldog even really offer? Maybe Pyongyang at least has some upside to grow and to become better. It just doesn't seem like that's going to happen with Bulldog anymore. And then Life, I kind of feel bad for Life because I don't think it's entirely his fault. He gets trolled by BRION pretty regularly, but this guy's been horrible. His production across this year has been pretty shit. He's kind of another player who's kind of been on the opposite side of the regression curve. It looked like he really found his form again last year on FPX, where I thought he was great. He was an all-pro caliber LPL support in my opinion, but you know, obviously a lot of creative picks in the mix there. Things like Rumble support that really helped him out a lot that aren't quite as meta anymore. He comes back here to the LCK and, you know, he just can't really find his footing. He's constantly dying in the mid game. He has no pressure. Part of that is, again, that BRION gets just so far behind every game in the jungle that Life ends up getting caught out just trying to place wards in pretty normal spots, but he's also taking bad fights and just generally engaging at the wrong times. So, you know, the DN Freecs are bad. They're expected to be the worst team in the league, and starting at 1-17 going into a split, certainly not the best place to kick off your summer split, but, you know, if they're going to be able to rebound, maybe they could at least be more interesting than number 10. I think that's possible. I think there's something here to build off of. I just would be surprised with how bad this mid-jungle duo has been, how bad top and support have been. Even if Berserker is trying, it feels like he is also really starting to check out. If that trend continues, this team might not even win a single series. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is the other team that I think is at like the bottom of the standings. The bottom two to me were pretty clear just in terms of roster construction. It's DRX coming in at number 9. They were significantly better, obviously, than DNF were in the spring split, and that's why it felt pretty obvious to put them at number 9. But from a roster perspective, can I really say that they have a better roster? It's hard for me to say that, and that's with a lot of question marks about who is starting in a couple of specific positions, which obviously we will go over. But I believe their roster is looking like Rich in the top lane, Sponge in the jungle, UCal in the mid lane, Lazy Feel at AD carry, and Ondel at support. Quick aside, because, you know, I have to talk about potential roster changes if they could and might happen, you know, for DRX. I want to make sure that there is at least an opinion out on the players and how the team would look if they made some changes. They have a mid laner, an AD carry, and a support that they could potentially, you know, switch up. The reason I have these 5 listed is because the other players, in particular, Yehu, Teddy, and Plata, were playing in Asia Masters for DRX Challengers, and so that leads me to believe that that is their Challengers League team, and that the other players, in this case, UCal, Lazy Feel, and Ondel, are going to be the ones starting in the LCK. That's not how things ended up at the end of last split. At the end of spring, you had UCal benched and you had Yehu starting in the mid lane. But again, with Yehu playing Asia Masters, it leads me to believe that UCal will be back in as the starting mid laner. If that doesn't end up happening, then obviously we'll discuss what that means for the team as a whole. But the players we do know are starting are on the top side, Rich and Sponge. And to their credit, both of them I think have been better this year than I thought they would be. I know DRX has been a bit of a disaster, but it's for a couple of other reasons. Rich and Sponge have not been the problem the whole time. At the very least, Sponge certainly has not been the answer, but Rich has been fine. He's been a slightly below league average top laner. There have been games where he's been successful and he's been able to generate his own leads, which is not something he's really known for, especially at the LCK level when he was playing for Nongshim. And so it's been nice to see him kind of grow into being a slightly better laner in a meta where I think players like that should have theoretically struggled more, just as we talked about potentially due to, shockingly underperforming in a meta that he should have been better at. Rich is a player that I thought would be obliterated by the lane swap changes, and he was generally fine. He's still not a good laner. Like, I don't want to make that, assumption. I don't want to sit here and be like, he completely turned it around and now is like a league average to above league average laner. He's just not bottom 1, which I think he had been for a majority of his career in terms of his 1v1 stats, and so he's been fine. He's been a stable enough top lane player that you can play through if he does get a lead in the early game. Sponge has also been a player that, last year he was maybe the worst player in the LCK, was certainly, kind of making a run for that title, and with the amount of game time that he got, not really improving wasn't a great look, but going into 2025, the org clearly trusted him. They brought Juhan back over from Giant X and the LEC, and, it was one of those things where it's like, well, why aren't you starting him? He's clearly the better player, but they had faith that Sponge was going to continue to grow, show more of that Challengers League tape, and he's done that. He's had better games, I would say, across 2025 than he did across 2024. The bar was in hell, and so it's not necessarily, difficult to be able to overcome that, but Sponge has been generally fine, like a below league average jungler and somebody who, at times can actively do well, especially if his mid laner is actually winning. That seems to be the big thing that he relies on in order to feel comfortable pushing pressure in the mid game. But if that happens, he looked good in winter. And so it's one of those things where, I get it. I get running him back, but that brings us to the big conversation, and that's UCal in the mid lane. This guy is supposed to be the star of the team, and he was just horrendous in the spring split. There's nothing else to say. And it's shocking because when you go back to winter, even for DRX, he was one of the big reasons why that team felt like a top 6 team in the LCK, why we thought they were better than a team like KT Rolster going into spring, because UCal was quite frankly just as good as BDD was in the winter split, and it felt like DRX had more pieces surrounding UCal that felt more consistent with everything kind of going wrong for KT. Obviously, that did not pan out in the spring split, but that was how much faith we had in UCal, and that's even going back to like his LPL days where he was 1v9ing on Thunder Talk, where he was like really trying to carry that team. It felt like he was just going to be yet another BDD, a really good mid laner in the LCK that's on a bad team, and there were too many good mid laners for that to be something that really elevates you as a player, but the wheels fell off in the spring split. There's nothing else to say. He was genuinely one of the worst players in the whole league, regardless of position. It's not just, oh, he underperformed and he wasn't able to carry the team and be the star. He was actively dragging them down, and if that's going to be the case, this team is done. Like, there is no way for them to be able to work in any capacity if UCal is going to be anything other than a top 5 or 6 mid laner. If he is the number 7 mid laner, like I'm giving him here, and let's be clear, number 7 is generous for how he played across last split. It's just, there are, players like Calyx and Daystar that we're going to talk about a bit later that at least haven't proven as much as UCal has in the past, that I just have to rank UCal above, even if he was worse in terms of production than those players were. But, like, if he's number 7, which I think is a fair way to put put him, that's not good enough. DRX is absolutely bottom 2 if UCal is, number 7. If this is Yehu starting in the mid lane and UCal is benched and they really don't feel comfortable playing him at all, this team is definitely closer to number 10, because Yehu would probably come in closer to number 9 or number 8 in terms of these mid lane rankings anyways. I'm giving UCal at least some benefit of the doubt because he's looked so good in the past, even for this DRX team in winter, so you just have to hope that spring was some sort of ridiculous outlier and that him getting benched will, awaken the fire in him again. And then with the bot lane, LazyFeel and Ondel, I'm just not super high on what we saw in the spring split. LazyFeel is a player that I've really liked in the past. I thought his aggressive tendencies reminded me a lot of when this team had Paddock as their starting AD carry and they were just kind of giving the reins to somebody who could really go out there and be super mechanically intensive, not really have a brain, but like try to play fights around, Sponge and UCal's setups. And, Rich is a relatively smart player as well. LazyFeel's not as good as what Paddock was for that team. I think there's a chance that you can still get more out of him, but right now he just feels pretty bad. His numbers are not very good, especially in the early game where he's just not a particularly good laner, so we'll see how that ends up adapting. Ondel's just your stock standard below average support. I think he's fine. I think that there were a couple of really nice games from him down the stretch for DRX that kind of elevated his stock back up to like number 8 or so in terms of my support rankings when he was number 10 going into the spring split, but I don't think he's a difference maker. I don't think he ever projects to be a difference maker in the support position. This is one of the weaker bot lanes in the league. Top side is your quote-unquote like stable side, but it's Rich and Sponge, and that's not good. And whatever you get out of UCal at this point is like, you just kind of flipping a coin. So DRX is not a team I feel particularly good about. If the DN Freecs weren't as bad as they actually are, I would feel pretty good about DRX being a 10th place LCK team. That being said, the DN Freecs are pretty terrible, and so DRX ends up getting that number 9 spot, but I think they're closer to being number 10 than they are to being number 7 or 8, which is a pretty terrible place for them to be. Then moving on now to number 8, and I would say this is a tier jump from 9 and 10, who were pretty bad, and just I don't really expect a lot out of them, to, number 8, like, could be top 2 in Rise Group, and I really wouldn't be all that surprised if everything were to go right. Should be a team that ends up at least, making the play-in stage. Not that I think they'll do a ton there, but for me, coming in at number 8, it will be okay BRION. I think this team still has some parts to unlock. I think they could even get better going into summer. There's reason to believe in progression for them, more so than maybe even the team above them at number 7, but for now I have them at number 8 because that's just generally how they performed throughout a lot of the spring split, and it's hard for me to just look at them and say like they're definitely going to be able to figure it out and turn things on. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Morgan in the top lane, Krako in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Hype at AD carry, and Polu at support. Some pluses and minuses, as per usual, especially with these next two teams, 8 and 7, in the power rankings. These are teams that have clearly defined strengths and, in my opinion, clearly defined weaknesses that will likely be difficult for them to overcome. For BRION, their strength right now is mid lane, which is kind of a shock. I didn't think that was going to be the case going into 2025, but Closer has been everything he was supposed to be for this team. I've been pretty anti-Closer during his time in the LCK, going back to when I was talking about that 2022 Live Sandbox team, when I really started to cover the LCK every single day, or every single week, I should say, on this channel. Like, I was really anti-Closer. He was getting all pro, third team. Really, I was like, man, Krako, Prince, and KL just got Closer and all pro nod. Like, congratulations to him. He wasn't really doing anything for that team, but he ends up getting a lot of credit because he was on a team that was particularly good, and his stats generally looked all right because he's a good laner. But then we saw in 2023, 2024, we started to see him get exposed a lot more when the talent level around him got significantly worse. He wasn't quite the player that could elevate a team like that, like a BDD could, like someone like a UCal did over in the LPL. Closer wasn't that kind of player, and I think that became increasingly clear as we continued to watch him on those Sandbox and FearX teams that just continued to underperform. He ends up going over here to BRION to kind of be your standard, like, league average mid laner in a league where the average mid laner is really good, right? He's fine. He's an okay player. He's not necessarily going to dominate. He's going to be better than the bad mid laners, and he's going to be worse than the good ones. That's what you thought you were getting. And then for a lot of spring, man, this guy was awesome. Like, he was genuinely right up there in terms of being like a top 3 or top 4 performing mid laner from the kinds of production that he was putting out. Like, we watched his matchup against Faker, and we watched him just kind of gap Faker in terms of how he played the game, and you're just like, oh man, Closer is actually like figuring things out on bro with all these resources being thrown at him. It did kind of trail off, I would say, towards the end of the split. I felt a little gun-shy of making him an all-pro nod, and generally I think that was the right call, all things considered, but he's still a very good mid laner, and honestly, he's playing the best league of his entire career right now, in my opinion, from an individual perspective. He still comes in as number 6, and if you know anything about the LCK, there is a big 5 in terms of mid laners in the LCK. If Closer's just the best mid laner outside of the big 5, that's pretty good. Like, that's really not that bad of a place to be, and that certainly helps OK BRION in terms of their, projection out into Rise group, and I think the top side of the map is still a positive for this team. You still have Lord Morgan on the top side here, and while he's not quite playing at the same level he did last year or in 2023, he's still been fine. Like, do I think he's a great top laner? No. I don't even think he's really like a B top laner anymore. He's probably closer to that B- in terms of what we saw out of him in the spring split, but B- is still perfectly usable. He's going to be fine in lane. He's going to be fine in team fights. If you get him accelerated, he can still carry games in the right scenario. I just think that scenario is a bit more limited than it was before, but he's still a positive, especially with top lane, near the bottom of the standings, not really being all that good. And I still really like Krako, and this is where I think the upside ends up coming in for this team. Not the only place where the upside ends up coming in, but where I think, if this team is going to get, 7th, if they're going to be a team that actually tries to compete to make playoffs and at times looks like a team that can make playoffs, I think it's going to be because Krako and Closer end up clicking again as a mid-jungle duo. You brought Krako in, a little too late into the offseason going into the spring split. He couldn't play the first round robin for the team, so you had to kind of, shuffle a lot of players in. You had, obviously, I think it was Elam playing quite a bit in the jungle at the beginning of the split, and then Hambach ended up coming back in. But once Krako was able to play, this team was notably better after he ended up coming in, and that was with Krako, I think, underperforming in quite a few games. I think that there is a world where he can reassert himself as maybe like a top 5 or top 6 jungler in the LCK. I certainly think that that's not an unreachable goal for a player like Krako, but we do kind of need to see him do it. I think there is, like I said, reason to believe that it could happen as an aggressive player who wants to be, aggro in the early game. If him and Closer can actually generate a lot of leads against these weaker teams that they're going to be playing pretty regularly in the Rise group, then yeah, I think there's a chance that outside of, Dplus KIA, they could be the best mid-jungle duo in Rise, and that would elevate them to probably being number 7. I just kind of need to see it happen before I just crown that as the reality, because it really wasn't the case in spring. And then you've got Hype and Polu. Hype obviously will not be able to play against KT Rolster, but that doesn't matter because they're not in the same group in terms of how things go. So Hype is like the full starter now for OK BRION. I believe he will be playing every single game. Bull doesn't need to be listed as an alternate here unless something crazy ends up happening. But, Hype and Polu, I think, are the swing point for the team, quite frankly. I've really not been impressed with what I've seen from these two. Hype's getting a lot of hype, pun entirely intended, in terms of just, him coming off of that KT Challengers roster, and every single one of those players kind of being talked about as, a future really good starter in the LCK. We've seen players like Hambach and like Wei, his former support, just completely crash out, be unplayable at the LCK level. Hambach was probably the worst player maybe outside of Wei in the winter split. Hambach got another chance in spring to retake that job before Krako was able to play, and he still couldn't do it. Like, it wasn't very good. Hype, I think, has been the best of those KT Challengers players, but I think he's still not been like dominant. There are games where it looks really good and games where it feels like he's comfortable, especially playing from neutral, and I really don't think he's that bad of a player, but AD carry is a tough role in the LCK. There are 7 or so like really good AD carries, depending on how you view Berserker, 6 for sure really good AD carries in the LCK, and Hype has just not been better than those players, in my opinion. If he can take that leap, I think Bro ends up being, pretty clearly against 7th, and same thing with Krako. Polu's a player I'm kind of not expecting to take that leap at this point. He just feels like you're slightly below average. Support very Ondul coded in terms of how we talk about him with DRX. I think it's a very similar story with Polu. I think he's a slightly worse version. He was better than Ondul in the winter split, but worse than him in the spring split. Kind of up to you where you want to rank him, but 8 to 9, that's kind of the range for a player like Polu. Overall, Bro do have things going for them. Like I said, Krako and Closer getting together and like really being able to elevate their own performances would be huge, and if Hype can turn that corner and be a top 7-ish AD carry, then yeah, this team's number 7 in terms of how they perform. But for now, I just need to see those things happen before I just crown them, especially with Morgan kind of taking a small step back, Krako taking a step back from his time on AL, and me not really believing that the bot lane is going to be that right now in 2025, even if they have good upside. Like, BRION is just one of those teams where, I'm taking more of a reserved approach, especially with this org not necessarily having a great track record. But then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and again, the difference between BRION and this number 7 team, not very large, but I just have a little bit more faith in the floor of BNK FearX in terms of just where they're at. I think their 7th place finish in spring was more encouraging than BRION's was, and I think generally it's just because I have so much faith in this bot lane to still be good moving forward that even though I have questions basically everywhere else when it comes to FearX, I still believe pretty heavily in what this team is going to be going up against other teams in the Rise group. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Saboro in the top lane, Raptor in the jungle, Daystar in the mid lane, Diablo at AD carry, and Kellen at support. Again, some roster, conversation to at least have here when it comes to some of these players. Daystar did come in midway through the split for Vikla, at least towards the end of the split. I would be shocked if Daystar is not starting moving forward. It does look like he is actually a good piece for this team. Vikla was a disaster. He would have been one of the lowest rated players in the LCK had he still been starting. He is not. And so Daystar coming in does give me more optimism surrounding FearX. And Saboro in the top lane, you could make a similar story for. Obviously, he comes in for Clear, who just looked entirely mentally checked out throughout almost all of 2025, with the exception of the beginning of the split where FearX was like randomly winning games. But outside of that, Saboro coming in isn't particularly surprising. I'm less high on him in terms of what he's shown so far in the LCK, but I still think he could be playable at this level if everything were to go right. Worth noting that it's theoretically possible for them to switch this around more in terms of their starting players depending on who they want in the lineups, but that's kind of neither here nor there, at least in terms of the main discussion about how good this team is, because this entire team revolves around the bot lane. Like, there is nothing else to say. Diablo and Kellen were excellent in spring. They were excellent in winter. This is a top 4-ish bot lane in the LCK stuck on a really bad team, and I think that's just kind of the reality of the situation. Diablo is obviously the one who's going to get a lot of credit for how things are going with FearX, and rightfully so. This guy's crazy aggressive. He's really mechanically talented. He's good in lane. He's good out of lane. He's a pretty versatile player. This is somebody you look at as a potential future star, somebody who's likely to get poached in the offseason by a better team. I don't think FearX is going to be able to keep a player of his talents around unless they build a really good team around him, because he should probably be competing to go to Worlds in terms of the kind of production that he's had as a rookie in the LCK. I did not see this coming in terms of just what he was as a prospect coming out of the Challengers League. To me, when I talked about him coming out of the Challengers League, he was a very mechanically talented AD carry that had not really put all the pieces together. Basically, from day one, he had been like the breakout star of the LCK across this year. So really cool to see that for Diablo. Really happy for him, and I think that he is the reason that FearX comes in at number 7. Like, this is a team that we all projected to be like last in the LCK, even going into the spring split, and Diablo is the reason that they are not. So, credit to him. He's a really good player. And then for Kellen, he's also a player that I'm going to defend. I know everyone has such a bad reputation of Kellen. He has like a bad rep in the community. It seems that a lot of, other teams don't necessarily value him super highly, but all this guy has done is elevate AD carries. Like, his entire career, he's just made the AD carries that he's next to look better than they actually are. I'm not saying Diablo's a bad player, but we go back to his kind of, I would say, breakthrough, but really his first opportunity majorly in the LCK with Gen.G, and obviously he got to play with Ruler, but, he was pretty good in that stint. He goes over to Nongshim, and him and Dektum have incredible chemistry and end up almost propelling that team to Worlds. They're one of the biggest pieces alongside Peanut as to why that team did so well. He goes over to Dplus KIA. Him and Dektum continue to be a better bot lane than they get credit for, at least statistically speaking. They were, probably top 3 or top 4 in terms of the LCK at the time, even if expectations were a lot higher because they were replacing these World Championship caliber bot lanes with Ghost and Beryl. But, Kellen was okay. Aiming comes over as the new starting AD carry once they want to go in a different direction there, and Aiming has a career year on DK last year, ends up looking really good for that team. He ends up going over here to FearX, and Diablo already starts playing well and starts playing great. Like, I'm not saying Kellen is just the AD carry whisperer, but this guy's macro is incredible. He's like one of the best shot callers in the world. I think that is pretty clear at this point. Every single DK team that has tried to replace Kellen, whether it be with Bible or whether it be with Moham last year, like, all of them got worse once Kellen was gone, not because his mechanics were unreplaceable or anything like that, but rather because his shot calling was not being replaced properly by these players coming in. And that's kind of been the case for FearX, who's had pretty decent macro, all things considered, throughout this year, considering they're a pretty bad team. And Kellen, even mechanically speaking, has really shown a lot of flashes this year. Now, again, he was worse, I would say, down the stretch for FearX, but I still believe a lot in Kellen. I believe a lot in Diablo. And I think this is, a borderline top 4 bot lane, like I said, in the LCK, and that's why they come in here at number 7. But it's the rest of the team that has major question marks. Raptor, I think, has shown good flashes in the past. He's been a player that I've felt decent about at times previously, where he's shown the ability to carry games, but he really is your, like, stereotypical modern jungler in the sense that from ahead, this guy's very scary. He's really good at pressing advantages, and he likes to play really aggro when he has gold leads. From behind, this guy is unplayable. Like, when he's at gold deficit, when he's not winning in the early game, he's just not a player in the game, and it can be really frustrating to watch that. We've seen that more and more commonly come out of a lot of junglers recently, especially, you know, players that are coming through the system. I think solo queue has really encouraged that behavior, but Raptor definitely falls into that category. Very mechanically talented, very aggressive, but not ever going to be able to play from behind. That's still pretty valuable. He comes in as the number 8 jungler for me. I think he's playable at this level. I don't think he's going to push your team forward. I certainly don't think he's going to raise the consistency of your team, but he's fine enough from a player perspective. Daystar, I think, is really where you start to get into some upside conversations. If he can actually be as good as he was in small stints with FearX in the spring split, like, this could be a 3-headed monster with him, Diablo, and Kellen, and that could be enough to really propel this team into being more relevant. I like Daystar. I think that there are parts of his tape that are just really good. You know, we've seen players come up into the LCK, show flashes, and never be able to capture that energy, but I have to continue to latch onto these flashes because the bottom tier of mid laners in the LCK, like, quietly not very good. You get past Closer at number 6, and you're like, okay, UCal, Calix, Daystar, Bulldog, like, these are all players that Daystar's upside could be better than in terms of just what we've seen recently. So if he ends up coming in closer to number 6 or number 7 in the mid lane rankings, don't be super surprised, but that would be really important for FearX, and I think that would really solidify them as a team. And then you've got Saboro on the top side. He comes in as my number 10 top laner. I just have not really loved what I've seen so far. I think top lane's a decent position. I don't know if they're not just better off playing Clear. I get that he's mentally checked out, but I think Clear has significantly more mechanical upside, even if he is way more inconsistent. I think at this point, you just kind of have to throw that at the wall and see what sticks, but if they do just want to run back Saboro in the top lane, he's fine. He looks to be a tank player. He can play carries. He did in the Challengers League, but from what we saw in the LCK, his carry gameplay was definitely not good enough to be able to go up against other LCK top laners. So, you know, we'll see how that ends up playing out. I wouldn't be surprised if this is just Clear starting in the top lane, if this is just even Vikla starting in the mid lane, but in that case, I think the conversation kind of switches where, like, oh, maybe Clear has a better split than he did in spring, and Vikla is just going to be the one that you don't really care about in the mid lane. I think the perfect combination for me would be Clear, Raptor, Daystar, Diablo, Kellen. I think that to me is what I would roll out if I was FearX, but, you know, whatever they end up deciding, it's all about the bot lane. If Diablo and Kellen can carry games, if Raptor can step up and basically just be this, you know, funnel machine that gets a ton of gold and can end up really snowballing games in the mid game to allow Diablo to play more aggressive and to be able to step up and things like that, and especially if someone like Daystar can come around, or if they can get anything out of either of their solo lane spots, whoever is starting in them, you know, that's going to be FearX's avenue to being better than this. For now, I think they're better than BRION because I trust this bot lane a lot. I think there's also a chance that they end up falling out and, you know, end up being an 8th or 9th place team. I'd be more surprised by that because of how good the bot lane is, but, you know, we'll see moving forward. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this becomes really interesting because top 6 is obviously my projected playoff teams. I think most people have these teams in their top 6, but coming in is our first Legend group team, which means that a Rise group team ends up outranking a Legend group team in these rankings. Not that anybody should be particularly surprised by this outcome, but coming in at number 6 for me, it will be NS RedForce. I do believe they are the weakest of not only the Legend group teams, but the top 6 right now that I think have separated themselves. Like I said, I think there was a tier jump from 9 and 10 to 7 and 8. I think there's another tier jump from number 7 to number 6. And so, you know, we'll talk about NS because they've shown at times throughout this split an upwards potential of being top 4. I think that there have been large portions of 2025 where they felt like a top 4 team in the LCK. They've just not really been able to maintain it, and that gives me some concern because I think they're playing the worst league they've played all year right now, which is not really all that great. So again, we'll talk about it here. Their lineup is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Gideon in the jungle, Calix in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Lahens at support. I believe this is the starting 5. This was the starting 5 at the end of last split. No real reason for me to believe that it's going to go in a different direction, but a couple of big factors to talk about here because there's 3 players on this team that I think have played really well this year and have generally really elevated NS, and it's just about what you're going to get out of those final 2 spots. The good players, we'll start with the veterans. Kingen in the top lane. He's very quietly been the best player on this team. I know Lahens is going to get a lot of credit. Even Gideon, I think, will receive a lot of credit for quite a few of their wins. Kingen's been awesome for NS. His lane stats have been incredible. He's really been great in team fights. Honestly, he's just stepped up. I don't think he's played this well in terms of consistency, at least in the regular season, since maybe like DRX in 2022. Like, that's how far back you probably have to go for a King and split that was this good. He really does feel like an upper echelon kind of top laner in the world right now. And while I don't necessarily put him in that A tier in terms of just like where Zeus and Keen and, 369 over in the LPL, where all those players are at in terms of just how they find their own successes, Kingan's like the definition of a very good B+ kind of top laner that you can win with, that you can, really elevate a team with. He can be a number 2 or a number 3 option on a team that goes to Worlds. I think he is that good, and he showcased that. He comes in as my number 4 top laner right now in a really good top lane class, a really good 5-player top lane class, I will say. And then Lehends is obviously the other player that you really have to mention in terms of, players that have elevated this team. My only concern with Lehends is it does feel like he's a little bit out of meta in terms of just how things are going right now. This guy was unreal in Winter. He was a top 1, top 2 support in the world in the Winter split. It was actually insane just how well he was playing. We always have those questions about whether or not a support can elevate a team around them. Lehends was carrying this team as a support in the Winter split. Spring, it was a little bit more dicey. Man, there were a lot of games that just didn't look all that good. And man, is he obsessed with things like Elise in the support position. And while I do think those kinds of aggressive picks can really work out, Lehends did showcase quite a bit in the spring split that if he lost early, he was just not going to be as relevant. That was not the case in Winter. Maybe he ends up kind of fixing that. His meta read just feels quite bad, in my opinion, in terms of just how things are going. If that can turn around, like, again, the top 4 supports all come in as A- graded supports. They are all the same exact grade for me. You know who the top 4 are, but Lehends comes in at the bottom of that because I think his form in spring was the weakest of those 4, and he can jump all the way back up to number 1 if he ends up having a great summer split. But for now, it's just kind of difficult to project that because I do think his meta read is just a little bit out there. But Lehends is everything he was advertised to be coming back to Nongshim here. This is a guy who not only was really successful and was league winning on teams like Gen.G, but he was an MVP on KT Rolster in the middle as well. This guy has just succeeded everywhere he's gone, and since 2022, that breakout that he had, or I guess in my opinion, the breakout that he had, everybody was already high on him before that, but what I considered his 2022 breakout, ever since then, he's never really looked back. And then Gideon's the other player on this team that I think you have to shout out. You have to talk about in terms of being such a big influencing piece on this team. There have been moments where Gideon's felt like a top 3 jungler in the LCK because a lot of the junglers are not super consistent right now in the LCK in terms of finding form game in and game out. Unfortunately, that also kind of applies to Gideon. I still really like him moving forward. I think he's a player that's shown pretty linear growth over the course of his time in pro play, whether that be in the LPL or in the LCK. He's kind of gotten better every year, progressively continued to improve, which is really nice, and that gives me a lot of confidence that he's going to continue on that trajectory. Typically, players like that have better, curves going further along into their pro career than players who just kind of break out in one split. But, Gideon's also a player who's, pretty inconsistent. Another player who kind of subscribes to that, mindset of really good from ahead, not as great from behind. He is a great team fighter, which allows him to be a bit more useful than maybe a player like Raptor that we just talked about, but he's certainly not an established top-tier jungler in the same way that you're going to get out of a lot of the top 4 or top 5 guys in that role. He can be, and especially if he has another good split here in summer, he's really going to put himself in that conversation. But for now, he still has like 1 foot in, 1 foot out in terms of being in that upper echelon. And then you get to some question marks, man. Calyx and Jiwoo. Jiwoo's a player that was primed for a breakout 2025, and it's just not happening. In fact, I think he's taken some pretty major steps back in terms of how his performance has actually gone. He got benched partway through the spring split for Vital. And while I don't think Vital gives them a better upside or is a better player or, should actually be considered a relatively good starting choice for this team, like there's a reason Jiwoo got benched, and it's because he really wasn't playing all that well. He wasn't making this team better, and he was kind of holding them back because they were putting resources into him and he wasn't really doing anything with them throughout a lot of the mid to late game. He just needs to get back to actually playing well in the mid game. That's where I think things really fell off in the spring split. If he can do that and play off Lehends a little bit better than he has at the beginning of this year, he can still be a very good ADC at this level. But again, number 8 is about as high as I can put him right now in terms of the production that he has shown. He's got players hot on his heels like Hype that I think have maybe even been better than him over the course of this year, but you have to imagine that, situationally Jiwoo's in a better spot, and also historically Jiwoo's been a player that looked like he was going to break through, but that breakout that we were all hoping for, it just has not come to fruition so far in 2025. And then mid lane, what a revolving door for Nongshim this has been over the past, 3 years in terms of their organization, basically, their entire history, even going back to when this team was good and they had had Gory as their starting mid laner. It never really felt like they found like a good mid laner that they could really stick to and trust. And Calyx is hopefully the one that they want to move forward with. Another prospect coming through the Nongshim system that looks great at tier 2 and then struggles to be able to translate that to tier 1. Now, Calyx looked awesome in his first couple weeks when he was starting with Nongshim coming in for Fisher, but after that, it just got worse and worse and worse. I think teams started to, figure him out a bit more, and his laning stats started to get significantly worse moving forward. If he can capture some of that energy he had at the beginning of his tenure in the LCK, like that player was a borderline top 5 or top 6 mid laner. Like he could be a guy who's basically what Closer is for Bro, except he has a way better team around him, which would be awesome for Nongshim, but it's just hard for me to project that that's definitely going to happen. He has that kind of mechanical upside. It's all about putting it together, which is something that all the other mid laners that they brought through their system have not been able to do, whether it's been, Call Me or Fiesta, whoever, all of the players, even Fisher that they brought in, right? Like nobody's been able to find that form for Nongshim. If Calyx can be that one, that's always been their missing piece. Kingen, Lehens, Gideon, they're good enough. If Calyx and Jiwoo can step up and really solidify, this can still be a top 4 team that makes worlds coming out of the LCK, but those things kind of need to happen, and especially with recent form, I'm feeling less and less confident that they're going to happen as we continue to go along. That means they come in at the bottom of this kind of middle tier, number 6 in my rankings, but certainly a team that has at least more upside than the 4 teams we talked about previously. But that's going to bring us to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is an upper half team that is in the lower group, the Rise group. It's Dplus KIA coming in at number 5 for me. They're the number 1 team in the Rise group. I think everybody is going to agree on that. Like I said, it is clearly like a top 6 and then a bottom 4 right now in the LCK, but that doesn't mean that Dplus KIA is inherently at the bottom of that top 6. I do believe they're better than Nongshim. I think that they will be better than what they were at the end of the spring split, where things just kind of were a disaster for them. There are reasons to be concerned. Like, I'm not going to pretend like there's no problems on DK right now, but to me, it's pretty clear that this team should be in the top 5 and can still very much make worlds like they've done all of the past few years. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Shiwu in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Aiming at AD carry, and Beryl at support. Some pluses and minuses towards what this team has been in terms of just what they expected out of these players at the beginning of the year. I hate to say I was spot on with DK, but you see that -1 next to the number 5 ranking. People were having this team in upper echelon conversations coming out of the winter split. They were talking about them because they were the best team in the regular season. They went on to winners finals and obviously lost in the lower bracket semifinals to Gen.G, kind of in an upset at the time. People did not think Gen.G were better than DK going into that series, but I had a lot less confidence in them being able to maintain that form going into the spring split, which is exactly what ended up happening. T1 ended up rebounding, Gen.G ended up rebounding, and I think a lot of people who had DK as a top 2 team ended up kind of, going through the DK experience. We'll just say that, the Dplus KIA experience. But I was also kind of spot on with what this team was at the start of the year. I've heard over and over again for years and years from, Dplus KIA fans, from Damwon fans, like, oh, just bring Beryl back. Why do we have Kellen? Just bring Beryl back. Just bring Beryl back. And now they're getting to experience why just bring Beryl back was always an idea that I pushed back on, because Beryl's not very good, man. Like, I don't really know what else to say. Let's get into him first because it's my controversial opinion. He's coming in as my number 6 support. I genuinely don't think you can put him higher than this. I think everybody that is above him on this list is inarguable. The only one is Kellen, but honestly, Kellen's been better this year than Beryl has been. I don't even think that's debatable. Again, just from a raw production standpoint, if you want to say that Beryl projects better moving forward, I can understand that. Beryl typically is a player who steps up in big moments, but during the regular season, it's clear that he mentally checks out and often makes gigantic mistakes, and quite frankly, he's been doing that in big best of 5s as well recently, so for Beryl, I think we're just at the point now where everything he was for KT Rolster and what he was, for parts of his time on DRX, like, that's just who he is. Like, this is not a top-tier support in the LCK anymore. He hasn't been for quite a while, and I think that the tape is just kind of showcasing that. He finally had a full split on DK for DK fans to be like, oh, this is Beryl? Yes, this is Beryl. This is who he has been for quite a while. But that's not to say this bot lane is bad. Beryl can still be very effective, especially when the rest of his team is winning, and Aiming has been Aiming. Like, he's been everything that this guy has been throughout his entire career, which is to say a very passive laner, somebody who doesn't really generate gigantic leads, but can still get marginal leads throughout a lot of the early game. A lot of people take me saying that Aiming is a very slow player as me saying that he's not a good laner. I don't think that's necessarily true. I just don't think he tries to dominate lane. Like, I don't think he's the kind of player with the mentality of wanting to try to get a 2v2 kill in the bot lane. It's just not really how he plays. He wants to get small leads that he can translate into late game team fights, and he still is very good in late game team fights, but like, he's still a limited player in the sense that he's kind of one-dimensional in the way that he plays the game, and, you know, I think he continues to get exposed in terms of really good laning 2v2s, just being able to outpace him and put him behind in terms of the resources that he's able to generate. It's always been his problem as a player. It's not really changed. I think Beryl being a roam-oriented support honestly kind of hampers his ability to play the game. So even if I think Aiming is a good player, he's not a top 380 carry in the LCK. I don't think anyone is arguing that. He might be the best of the rest, but he's a step down from the top-tier guys, and that's kind of what you need on a DK team here. And he's one of the higher-rated players. You've got players like Lucid that I think took a step back, I should say, in spring. Dude was incredible in winter. It felt like he was really building on his awesome summer split from last year, and it felt like he was getting better and better over the course of things. Did take a step back in spring. I think part of that was just the general setup of Dplus KIA. I'm not blaming him entirely for why spring split wasn't, you know, everything he wanted to be. I still think he can be a top tier jungler, but the guy that we were saying was a top 5 to 10 player in the world coming out of winter split, that's just not who Lucid is right now. He's still in a spot where I think he could be there by the end of the year if he just continues to recapture that form, and especially being in the Rise group. This guy should massacre all of the Rise group junglers. I think this could be a really dominant split, one that really kind of elevates Lucid's stock, but it's all really about whether or not he can show up in the big moments. I still believe in him as a player, you know, moving forward, and he's one of the pieces I'm most excited about on this team, if not the piece I am most excited about on this team. I'm just hopeful he can start to recapture that. Me putting him up to number 2 in terms of the jungle rankings was very, very premature, as it would seem, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. She was another player where he's coming in as my number 5 top laner. I really like this guy. Like, I think he has a lot going for him. I got a lot of pushback when I made him 3rd team All-Pro in the spring split. Like, people did not see his split as that good, and I don't really know what else you were looking for when it came to Shiwu. You know, can you talk about how the laning wasn't exactly perfect? Maybe, but he's arguably the best team fighter in the top lane role right now, and as a rookie, as somebody who's coming in pretty high, you know, pressure circumstances, really being asked to be a number 1 or a number 2 option for this team in a lot of games that wants to make worlds, like, I think he's doing a fine job. I think there are a lot of players that would do significantly worse than what Shiwu is doing right now, and really, again, the only reason he doesn't come in top 3 or top 4 is because, man, there are a lot of good top laners in the LCK. He comes in right below players like Doran and Kingen, and, like, obviously those players have a ridiculous track record of being successful, but Shiwu is not super far off from being what those players are. So coming in at number 5 is certainly not meant to be a disservice to him. Shiwu and Lucid are the upside of this team right now. And then we finally get around to the franchise player here for Dplus KIA, Showmaker in the mid lane. I'm still okay on Showmaker. I know that, you know, people turned on him a long time ago. I think we saw more of the negative qualities and traits in the spring split, but the reality of who Showmaker has been over the past couple of years is somebody that fluctuates in quality very drastically. There are going to be 2, 3, 4 week stretches across a split where he's like genuinely one of the best players in the world. We saw that in winter where he was performing out of his mind in the regular season. There are going to be stretches of time where he is just on fire, where everything clicks, where the meta is right in a spot where he can take over and he's going to dominate those weeks. And then at the same time, you are pretty much guaranteed to get at least 2 to 3 week stretches of time where he's not very good, where he doesn't perform like an upper tier mid laner in the LCK. The volatility of Showmaker is incredibly high, and that means it's difficult to rank him above the number 5 spot in terms of mid laners. Again, the big 5 are still there in the LCK, and I still would keep Showmaker in that upper echelon with, you know, all the other players like Faker and BDD and Zeka and Chovy. Like, he's still in the upper echelon of mid laners in the LCK, but he's at the bottom of that ranking pretty definitively now. I think a lot of people already had him there, but I think especially coming off of spring, where things just did not really go his way at all, you know, where he kind of got abused in a lot of the regular season games in lane. Like, there's just a lot of negativity surrounding Showmaker, and the volatility, even if he is going to give you those ridiculous performances that really make him look like a top 2 or 3 mid laner in the world at specific points during the year, if that's almost always going to be counterbalanced with all of these weeks where he just underperforms, it's really hard to buy into that. So for DK, like, you can see why they're in the Rise group. I'm lower on this team. I have been all year long in terms of what their expectations are. That being said, they still deserve to be in the top 5. I think their floor is much higher than a team like Nongshim, which is, again, why they come in above them. I think they have more talent here, and they can absolutely still make worlds. They're going to have a chance to go undefeated in the Rise group. I really do believe they're a full tier, if not like a tier and a half above every other team team in Rise Group, and that means they could even just go all the way through, just dominating teams and, consistently overperforming expectations. Whether that translates to a lot of confidence that leads into a good playoff run is to be determined, but they really shouldn't struggle at all in the regular season. And if they are going to continue to level up their play, if you get that good week of Showmaker at the right time, if Shiwu and Lucid take that next step, if Beryl can just lock it in mentally for a small amount of time, like we know what aiming is as a player, he's going to be valuable if the rest of the team is good. Like DK can absolutely still be top 3, top 4, somewhere around that, phase in the LCK, and they can still make worlds. It's just looking a lot harder now than it was at the beginning of the year. Then moving on to number 4 in my power rankings, and talk about a team that really accelerated their own stock towards the end of the spring split. It's KT Rolster that's just coming in inside my projected world spots. Remember, LCK gets 4 seeds because they were the best performing team at MSI, one of the top 2 alongside the LPL. So this is a projected worlds team right now, and honestly, how can you project anything else for KT Rolster in terms of how they performed at the end of that split? This was a team that looked like they could break their way into top 3 if everything were to go right, which felt untouchable for most of the year. I still have some concerns that there is a floor for KT Rolster, that there is a crashing back down to earth process that could theoretically happen for this team, because you got a lot of players that really stepped up down the stretch of the spring split that you just don't know are going to be able to do that super consistently. But man, what we saw at the end of the split, that's a worlds team, that's for sure. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Perfect in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, Dekdom at AD carry, and Peter at support. It's really interesting to talk about a team that went through so many roster changes and ended up with the same roster that started off in the spring split. You had Perfect going out, Casting coming in, and obviously them realizing that Perfect was going to be better. You had Dekdom coming out and Paddock coming in, and then them realizing that Dekdom was just going to be better for this team. Peter obviously came in at the beginning of spring for Wei, but, they really solidified that he was going to be an upgrade in the support position. They had the right lineup all along. They just needed to start committing to it and really locking in that these players could get used to playing with each other. And once everything really did start to work, man, did it really start to work. But how do you start talking about KT Rolster without mentioning their star player, first and foremost, BDD in the mid lane? I am full on the BDD train now. I know I've been considered a BDD hater in the past, which is crazy to me because I've consistently put him in the same tier as Faker and Showmaker. And, again, like some people might be like, how did you put BDD in the same category as Showmaker, who's been so much more inconsistent? If you watched my previous primers and my previous content, I've always been a lot higher on Showmakers like 2024 and 2023 than basically everybody else in the community. So don't sit there and be like, oh, how could he, justify that? Like, BDD has essentially been what Faker has been for T1 for many years. And so for BDD to come in at number 3, for this to be an upgrade for him, I think is pretty huge. And honestly, I really debated putting him at number 2 because I do think he just came off his best split in a long time. And he's been having great splits. Like, his individual performances have been incredible, but this one was especially good. I think because he really weathered the storm, right? Like, KT finally started to find some success. I think that's obviously helpful in terms of just, elevating his stock, but they did it without him, like, needing to be the number 1 guy every single game. I think that was the most encouraging thing, is that Cuz had a great second half, Dekdom had a great second half, Perfect had a great second half, and BDD kind of could just play his role that he's really good at, which is being the best secondary carry in the world. Like, that's where BDD, I think, thrives as a player, and that's what we saw out of him in the second half, and I think we continue to really see that emerge. And as long as Dekdom, Cuz, and Perfect continue to play well, and at least one of them starts to step up and be a primary option, if BDD can play as control mages and feel more comfortable playing a little bit slower in the early game, not feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, either he dominates and gets gigantic gold leads or they lose games, then I think KT is going to be very dangerous, because BDD is a top 5 to 10 player in the world, and that's very rare. Like, a team that has that just instantly is going to be in world's contention, basically, no matter what. But we can talk about the rest of this roster. Let's start with the top side here. We'll start with Perfect, a player who, again, ended up getting benched midway through the split. Casting came in. I've always been a huge Perfect defender. I really hyped him up coming up from the Challengers League at the time. Whether this has aged well or not is up to your own personal interpretation. But I was like, okay, Perfect is a better prospect out of the Challengers League than Thanatos was for Dplus KIA. Again, whether or not that's aged well is kind of up to, whether or not you want to give Thanatos credit for dominating North America, right? Like, it's hard to give the same kind of perspective, but Perfect was a prospect that I loved. I thought he was really established and really, polished as a prospect coming up. And while I don't think he really, like, bursted onto the scene and dominated the top lane in the way that, someone like Shiwu has for Dplus KIA, his consistency was a lot better than people gave him credit for, and his low games were not nearly as bad as people gave him credit for. I still think he was scapegoated a lot more than he deserved to be. KT Rolster and Scapegoats name a more iconic duo in the LCK, but, he was kind of scapegoated by this organization and by the fans. He ends up getting benched for, not performing great through the beginning part of the spring split, but certainly not being the problem. problem on this team with Cuz constantly down in gold basically every single game. And then he comes back and ends up actively just dominating and winning games for them. Like, this guy's mechanical ceiling is actually high, and I think people forget that because he has been such a stable and solid player on the top side. But, you know, best case scenario for Perfect is he turns into Keen. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're kind of beyond that point in terms of where his development arc is at. But, like, a slightly worse version of Keen, that's pretty good, where you can put him on tanks and you can feel very comfortable about that, but you can also let him carry games and feel comfortable about that as well. Perfect is a good player, and 6 might be even low in terms of the performances he gave in the back half. Again, the track record's not perfect, but, you know, perfect is not perfect, you know? That's okay. Like, he's a good player with an all-around skill set, which is nice. And then there's Cuz. Talk about a tale of two splits. Like, the first half of the split, this guy was one of the most actively detrimental players in the entire league. I thought he had a terrible winter. I think he didn't play all that great at the beginning of spring. And then the second half of spring happened, and I swear, like, there was no jungler that was more productive than Cuz. Like, look at the numbers that he ended spring with. He dominated almost every category. You could make an argument that just from a stats perspective, he was the best jungler in the spring split, and that's how dominant his second half was, because his first half was not good. Like, it was genuinely really bad, and his winter split, like I said, was also kind of bad. He didn't end last year all that well on a KDF team that was really struggling to find its form. Like, Cuz felt like a player that was kind of cooked heading into the second half of spring, and then everything just, you know, reignited for him. If you're getting that second half version of Cuz, like, that's not just a top 5 jungler, that's a top 3 or a top 2 jungler in the LCK. That again elevates you, and him and BDD played off each other excellently heading into the back half of the year. I think he trusted his bot lane a lot more in the back half of the year as well, but you know, Cuz's track record is not spotless. This is a guy who can be relatively streaky, and so if you do end up in a point where Cuz is a little bit more exploitable, where he's having some bad games, you could see this team get back into some negative form. I think his readjustment was a big reason why this team turned things around in the second half. A lot of their second half success rate and whether or not they are a Worlds team is probably going to be on Cuz. And then Dectum and Peter. Dectum, another player who was scapegoated quite a bit, although, you know, in his case more than perfect, he definitely deserved it. The beginning of this year was the worst he's ever played. He's always been like a great scapegoat target for whatever org he's played for. He was really good for Dynamics and Nongshim when they were kind of coming through and, you know, kind of breaking through and being the surprise underdogs of the LCK. And then he goes to Dplus KIA, and him and Kellen are the scapegoats because they're the new players. You have the same top side of the map. You've got established players there. Canyon and Showmaker were certainly never going to receive the criticism, even though Canyon was horrible in 2023. Dectum, it must be Dectum's fault. It must be Kellen's fault. And, you know, they get shipped off. He goes to DRX and gets a major elbow injury after that team completely collapses around him, and so he's never really able to show anything. But he goes to the LPL last year, figures something out on Fun Plus Phoenix, at times is the most consistent carry for that team, even though Milky Way's getting a lot of the credit. Him and Life were pretty good, comes back to the LCK and is horrible, like struggles to adjust. He gets benched, but he comes back, and now all of a sudden this is the Dectum we remember, the super stable, jack of all trades, master of none, AD carry that you feel really good about. He's not going to be the most dominant laner, he's not going to be the most dominant team fighter, but he's good at everything. Like, he really is like above average at pretty much every part of playing AD carry. And that's super valuable, and I think especially for a team that has, you know, BDD in the mid lane, Cuz in the jungle, like these players that really can carry games out of those roles, having an AD carry that you feel comfortable can play whatever you need him to play, early, late game, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, that is effective for KT Rolster, even if his mechanical ceiling isn't particularly high. And Peter is a player that I think also was awesome down the stretch. Talk about a playmaker, like, he really emerged as one of the better, like, engaged players in the world down the stretch. So, you know, I really like Peter coming in as a full-time starter. Wei was a disaster for this team, and Peter, I think, has added some stability, and him and Dectum seem to work off of each other well. Peter, a longtime channel darling going back to 2022 when he was on Nongshim and that team was a disaster. It's really cool to see him and BDD reunited in better circumstances here on KT and having it work out significantly more. So, you know, it's really hard to bet against KT being top 4 right now. That being said, from a talent perspective, I don't think this team is as talented as Dplus KIA. Like, I think that really is just where I end up landing. I think DK has more talent on their team from an individual perspective, but BDD is the best player across those two teams, and if you're going to get good performances out of Dectum, Perfect, Peter, and Cuz in the same way that you did down the stretch, then yeah, this team is easily top 4. I could also see a world where, again, they crash back down to earth, return to normal, and, you know, end up being a team that's around 5th or 6th. They didn't even look like a top 6 team for a majority of the beginning of the year. So there is a wide range of outcomes when it comes to KT Rolster, but their high end is pretty damn good. But that brings us to number 3 in my power rankings, and the top 3 are the top 3. I don't think anybody is really going to be arguing that going in to the LCK split. It really does feel like a 3-horse race right now, but, MSI and, maybe the end of the split really changed my opinion on the order of these 3 teams, because coming in at number 3, it's going to be Hanwha Life, and honestly, for most of this year, I would have had them at number 1 or number 2, like certainly with Gen.G going undefeated in the regular season, beating them twice, it felt pretty obvious to go for Gen.G at number 1, but honestly, coming out of the LCK, really before going back and rewatching tape, I still had HLE at number 2, I had T1 at number 3, and I think there is still a pretty reasonable outcome that is just what happens in the summer split. The T1 ends up making Worlds, and obviously still doing really well at Worlds, but going as the number 3 seed instead of the number 2 seed because HLE is just a bit more consistent, but there are some concerning traits about Hanwha Life, and I think T1 is getting better, and so for now, I have them in this order because of the most recent result, but I'll kind of go on to explain why it's not quite as simple as everyone wants to make it out to be in one way or the other. But HLE, Hanwha Life, their lineup is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Delight at support. I don't really want to bury the lead in terms of the main thing to talk about with HLE, so I'll kind of just go on and say, why they're at number 3 and why I considered them still for number 2. There have been a lot of valid reasons pointing in either direction. First and foremost, HLE got 3-0'd by T1 in the playoffs. That's what got T1 to MSI in the first place. When they needed to step up the most, they couldn't quite do it, but the only reason that they were in that series to begin with is because they blew a 2-0 series lead over Gen.G. They looked like they were going to be the team that was poised to take Gen.G's undefeated streak away from them, to not give them that perfect streak going into MSI, but they get reverse swept by Gen.G in that winners finals, the first place matchup, whatever you want to call it, and then they're clearly super mental boomed. They go into that T1 series and they lose. That's certainly not ideal. A lot of people have pointed out that, okay, well, HLE is very mental boomed. They were a team that was in a dominant position, and clearly Zeka just underperformed in a big moment, which he almost never does. There's a lot of reasons to believe that that will not happen again for HLE moving forward, but also there's a lot of people that talk about how this team was 500, a 500 to slightly below 500 team in the second half of the spring split, and that's correct. That is true. When you look at the second half, they were not a particularly dominant team. What people fail to mention when they talk about that is that one of their big wins towards the end of the spring split was a 2-0 in the regular season over T1. The only time HLE lost to T1 this entire year was in the playoffs, was that 3-0 coming a couple of days after, them getting reverse swept. That's certainly not an ideal set of circumstances, and so I really do think you can go either way. For now, HLE has a little bit more to prove because T1 did well at MSI, but who's to say HLE wouldn't have also gotten second at MSI, wouldn't have also been able to beat anyone's legend? I think that there is, now with EWC, at least some conversation about that, but it's best of 3s, man. One best of 3 anybody can win that. We've seen Bro beat Dplus KIA Damwon, best version of Damwon, many times in a best of 3. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that a best of 3 can't just, randomly go one team's way. So for HLE, still a lot to prove, and honestly, they have the talent to still be number 1. Zeus, in my opinion, is still the best top laner in Korea, and I think has a strong argument to be the best top laner in the world right now in terms of production. He was almost the MVP in the spring split. If Chovy wasn't utterly dominant in terms of how he performed for Gen.G, he probably would have been the MVP. This is a median MVP type of split from Zeus, and yet, we're talking about him as if he's like a choker. This is a multiple-time Worlds winner. Zeus is obviously still incredible, and I think he's playing better individually right now for HLE than he was for T1 because of the resource allocation of HLE as opposed to T1. I think they play very differently as teams, and it honestly opens up the door more for Zeus to be able to carry games from the top side with his gigantic lane lead. So Zeus is still coming in as my number 1 top laner, and Delight is still coming in as my number 1 support, and this is much more controversial, but again, the top 4 supports can kind of go in any order, whatever you really want to do. Was Delight the best support in spring? Probably not. Was he by far the best support in winter? In my opinion, yes. When you talk about the beginning of this year, it wasn't close, and Delight was at least in the conversation in spring, probably the 2nd or 3rd best support in the league in the spring split, and so for now, he ends up staying at number 1. I'm also kind of banking on the fact that Delight has consistently gotten better every single year of his entire career. This guy just continues to grow, and again, I don't see any reason for him to stop going into this year. I'm not going to say he's going to get a ton better, but if this guy just showed up and won MVP, I'm not going to be surprised, and I think he has the best shot of any support of doing so. So for me, he is still going to get that number 1 support ranking, and I still feel very good about Delight as a player, and I think you can make the argument that HLE still have the best bot lane in the LCK. Viper is a player that a lot of people are going to have at number 1. I already had Ruler at number 1 before MSI, and then he just goes off and has an incredible tournament at MSI, and so Viper ends up being, you know, a little bit outpaced in terms of the #1 grade for me, but, you know, Viper was maybe better for most of this year domestically, certainly was in the winter split. You know, in spring, I think Ruler was super undervalued. I have no clue what games people were watching when they say that he was horrible. I just don't think that that was true. I think it was just, you know, bad circumstance. He's playing on a team with a bunch of carries, and so, like, what? He's not going to individually carry every game? Like, the dude wasn't making gigantic mistakes. Viper wasn't either, but, you know, Viper still has best AD carry potential, and if this is the best bot lane in the LCK, that's their avenue to being, like, near the top of the standings. But ironically enough, it was the mid-jungle duo that let this team down in big moments, which has not been how HLE has operated. Zeka still is going to come in as my #2 mid laner, because it's really tough for me to look past years and years and years of high-profile, high-pressure performances where he's been able to step up in big moments and just say, well, he let his team down, he was awful in the final 3 games against Gen.G, and he got obliterated by T1. That means he's a bad player. I just don't feel that way. Like, I don't think that's necessarily true. Now, maybe his confidence was super shot after that Gen.G series where Chovy just kind of outplayed him in the back half of that series, and then he goes into T1 series and just doesn't have the mental. Who knows? But Zeka, you know, he's a player that I still believe in. Like, the regular season performances are there, the playoff performances are there, the Worlds performances are there. This is still an elite player. I'm not just going to dock him entirely. He still comes in as my #2 mid laner. If you wanted him at #3 below BDD, that's the only argument I think you could have for him going lower. But he's definitely better than Faker's form right now. He's definitely better than Showmaker's form right now. He's bare minimum a top 3 mid laner in the LCK. Peanut's really the only player who had, like, significant problems for a significant amount of time. Peanut was kind of bad in spring, low-key. Like, it was very strange to watch him play the game. He just was not generating the same kinds of advantages he normally does, and, you know, it was such an outlier that I do kind of want to throw it out, but there were pieces of this in winter as well. Maybe this is the year where it does kind of fall off a cliff for Peanut. We've seen this happen with junglers before where, you know, 1 year happens and they just kind of aren't able to keep up anymore. I don't think that's going to happen. Peanut's too good of a player for me to imagine that's going to happen. I'm still going to keep him as a top 3 jungler, even though he didn't perform like that in spring, but he is going to come in below the other 2 that I think are elite. Like, Canyon and Owner were just better than Peanut last split, and honestly, if Peanut performs the way he did, like, that's going to keep HLE as the #3 team. But Peanut really stepped up in the playoffs in winter, and he was really good at first stand, so who knows? Like, maybe Peanut comes back and is the #1 jungler again, and all of a sudden HLE is, you know, going on their own big winning streak in the regular season, because now Gen.G has to come back from EWC and basically no rest and immediately face HLE like 2 days later in Korea. Like, who knows? HLE could be the #1 team coming out of the regular season. I think that that is a possibility, but a lot of things do kind of have to turn themselves back around. I think the floor of this team is still incredibly high, and quite frankly, on paper, they should be a top 2 team, and they should be a team that competes to be #1. I'm just a little bit scared off by the recent performances. We'll see what they are when they start playing games. I'm excited to see this HLE team bounce back. But that brings us to #2 in my power rankings, and you know who #2 is because you know who #1 is. It's T1 coming in at #2. I think this is only fair right now. I think there's a strong argument that they should be #3. I don't think there is an argument that they should be #1. In fact, I would very much push back on the idea that there is any sort of #1 argument right now, but, you know, T1 did the T1 thing. They figured it out at the end of the regular season. You know, they go into the playoffs 0-2 in their final week, and then they just randomly start being good. They take down HLE, who looked better throughout the entirety of the year, who consistently had been able to beat T1. They take them down 3-0 because that's what T1 does, and then they go on and just be a better team than they ever were domestically, internationally. The only concern I have with putting T1 at 2 is not that I don't think this team is this good, but rather that I think they're not going to play like this domestically. They never play like this domestically. It's just not how T1 operates. They coast along in the regular season, they figure it out enough to go to Worlds, and then they actually show up at Worlds and show a whole side of them that we hadn't seen throughout the entire year. It's going to happen again. Mark my words, but at least for now, they come in at #2. So let's get into it. Their lineup is looking like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. I've talked about this lineup over and over and over again. Like, Doran's really the only new piece, but I've been talking about T1 for years, and the story really hasn't changed at all since then. And, you know, we just got done talking about them a lot at MSI, and so there's not really a lot to go over. Maybe just the rankings in terms of where people are excited or upset maybe by some of my rankings. Owner's going to come in the highest at #2. This guy was the most consistent piece for this team throughout the spring split. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. You know, Doran had some great team fights, but he was not a great laner. Faker had some up and down moments. I think generally he was the second best player on this team, though. And Guma and KIA for large sections of the split were just kind of bad with all the drama surrounding it. They obviously figured it out by the time they ended up, you know, going into playoffs. But Owner was the piece that was really kind of stabilizing T1 for a very long time. He was an MVP candidate for me. I think he ended in the top 5. I don't think he was quite top 3 for me in terms of MVP, but Owner was really good. First team all-pro jungle, in my opinion, you know, really a guy you could kind of rely on. And we've been waiting for Owner to show that. I've been guilty of calling him like a system player in the past. I kind of had talked about, oh, well, if Owner was on any other team with significantly less talent and didn't have the laners that were going to be able to dominate in the same kind of way, I didn't think he was going to be able to succeed the way he did on T1. I thought he was kind of a product of the T1 system. I think for the most part, 2025 has eliminated that thought from my mind. Owner is genuinely just one of the best junglers in the world, and I think really T1 might be holding him back in terms of what he can do individually as a player, because we saw what it looked like when he was the #1 option consistently for this team in the spring split, and he was an MVP candidate. So, you know, that's kind of the Owner that you're hoping that you get moving forward. It was similar to what we felt about Gumayushi in 2024, where it was like, has this guy been here the whole time? Like, he's actively able to 1v9 a ton of these games, and so that's really good to see out of Owner. Faker was, like I said, probably the second best player for this team. Mid lane's just hyper competitive. I don't think Faker, mechanically speaking, is quite on the level of a BDD or a Zeka in terms of how he's going to dominate domestically, but Faker is still super valuable. Again, coming in as the #4 mid laner in the LCK is like the #1 mid laner in almost any other region. In fact, it would be the #1 mid laner in any region that's not the LPL, and even then, it's #2 in the LPL, only behind Knight. Like, Faker really is just that good in terms of how he plays the game, and that's how good the LCK mid laners are. Faker can sometimes struggle with mid-game pressure. He can sometimes be too far forward or just be really aggressive. You know, there's a reason that the Faker global taunt exists in the first place. Yes, it's a good thing that he's able to draw and absorb so much pressure because he's one of the best defensive players of all time, but like, he's always overextended. Like, that's always just what Faker is doing. He just feels comfortable being able to get out of it because of his mechanics, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like, we've seen it kind of punish him domestically and take bad fights domestically, but, you know, internationally it seems to always work out because the team is always there to protect him. For now, Faker is just a very good player, somebody who's going to be super valuable to T1, maybe just not quite as good domestically as he is internationally. It's just kind of how it goes. He rests his arms a little bit, rests his wrists a little bit domestically. And then you've got the bot lane. Let's talk about them here. Guma and KIA. They're back in form. They are completely back in form, I would argue. Guma doesn't quite feel like where he was at in 2024 in terms of just how productive he is. Part of that is probably the role on the team, but he definitely is a lot closer to like 2023 Guma than he was to like beginning of 2025 Guma, where it was like, why are you not playing Smash? Smash was better in winter, and, you know, quite frankly, when Guma got reinserted at the beginning of spring, it was like, was this the right call? Guma's not playing particularly well. So nice to see him in the second half really find his form, get better and get more comfortable after the drama starts to subside, and then be good going into playoffs. And KIA kind of in a same vein. I think KIA had a couple of nice moments throughout all of the split, but again, a player that was significantly more inconsistent than he got credit for, really stepped it up in the playoffs and was probably their best performer to get them to MSI, was really good at MSI as well, and now obviously is returning to continue to be great. I still have them both at #3 because regular season does matter, and quite frankly, the regular season wasn't great for them. If I'm ranking you for the regular season, then 3 I think is fine in terms of what you can expect out of them, but in big moments you could expect them to step up. And then Doran, you know, pretty one-dimensional player at this point in terms of what he's become. If he's able to beat you in lane, he's going to be very dominant as a player, and he is going to be able to look like one of the best top laners in the world. He is going to pretty consistently lose lane against the best top laners in the world. He even saw that a bit at MSI, although it was better at MSI than I was expecting. But as a team fighter, he's still one of the most consistent. Like, if not the most consistent in terms of making gigantic game-altering plays. And honestly, that works better for T1 than Zeus did as a guy with gigantic gold leads. And so, who knows? If T1 just goes and, you know, runs this split and ends up actually showing up domestically, I might actually be a little surprised. If this team randomly, you know, loses, you know, 5 series in the Legend group and, you know, is consistently losing to KT and to Nongshim and whatever, then, like, yeah, you know what? That's kind of the T1 I remember. They're going to make Worlds as the #3 or #4 seed, and they're going to dominate at Worlds. That's the version of T1 that we've always gotten. That being said, it's hard to rank them lower than #2 with just how well they played at MSI. Maybe they don't end up living up to this in terms of their domestic ranking, but in terms of team strength, I think it's pretty fair to put them here. But that's going to bring us to number 1 in my power rankings, and how could it be anybody else? It's the team that went undefeated across the spring split, your MSI champions. It's Gen.G, and obviously this team is number 1. They're the number 1 team in the world until proven otherwise right now, because they've just been on an unreal run. This is one of the best splits of all time, 18-0, 36-5 domestically. That includes a 19-0 win against Hanwha Life in the playoffs that got them to MSI as the number 1 seed from the LCK, and then what do? They go undefeated at MSI as well, not in terms of games, but in terms of series. Quite a lot of game 5s actually against AL, against T1 twice, but they end up, being the team that comes out on top in the big moments. And if you ever had concerns about whether or not this team was going to be able to step up when it mattered the most, I hope this past split kind of really illuminated that is possible. They were down 0-2 against Hanwha Life and came back and reverse swept them with players stepping up in big moments. They were, up against T1 in big moments at MSI, up against anyone's legend in big game 5s, and they always came through. This is a clutch, really talented, incredibly dangerous team, and they're the best in the world right now. Their lineup is looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Duro at support. Obviously, I can go player by player and talk about their strengths, but you know who these guys are. We've been talking about them regularly on this channel. Keen in the top lane is somebody that people might be frustrated to see at number 2 and not at number 1 over Zeus. I think Zeus has been better so far in 2025, but Keen is ridiculous, and quite frankly, he's on an incredible run right now. When you talk about his playoff form and how he played against HLE in that reverse sweep, he was incredible there, and he was awesome at MSI. Like, he was truly great at that tournament, looked like the best top laner at that tournament, which is really encouraging to see. If Keen's gonna step up and be best top laner in the world quality, which we know he can be, yeah, if that's your weak link, whatever, man. Like, Keen's just good at everything. He's a good tank player. He's a good carry player. There's a reason I said, perfect is, Keen light in terms of how he is, in terms of how he plays the game, because this jack of all trades, master of all playstyle is really hard to deal with, and Keen is probably the best in the world at that style. Canyon's going to jump up to my number 1 jungler. At this point, I feel pretty confident putting him at number 1 in terms of how these rankings go. Is he going to have bad games? Yes. Is he going to be inconsistent? Yes. Is he going to look better on specific champions and specific champion, archetypes? Yes. He's going to be a carry player. He's not going to be a tank player, but man, his best games are just better than anybody else in the world. It's just true. Like I know he's not versatile. I know he's not the most consistent player, but when he just dominates the way that he does, and with Gen.G finding so many consistent ways to let him dominate games, yeah, that's the best jungler in the world in terms of actual, production. I would still take Tarzan over Canyon, but Canyon has pretty consistently been the number 1 jungler in the LCK, and so he will get that ranking here. Chovy is Chovy. What do you even want me to say? He's the best player in the world, and it's not close. If you were concerned, Choky, whatever, the guy in my comment section who's always like Choky, or everybody on Twitter or Reddit or whatever that likes to, further that, this guy just absolutely demolished T1 in the finals of an international tournament. If that's not a sign that he is good enough to be able to overcome those demons, I don't know what is. You can talk about his form being inconsistent. You can't say it's choking, because he is clearly good enough to show up in big moments. He was awesome, again, against HLE. He was the MVP, really without any sort of parallel in the spring split. He really was that good for an undefeated team. He's the best player in the world, and this is the first time I can say this in a long time. There's no one on his tier. He is A++, he's S+, and there's no one else even within reaching distance of his performance right now. He's 1, and then everybody else is a full tier and a half below him in terms of just how things are going. Chovy has officially become the final boss of League. Maybe not so much at Worlds, maybe that ends up being his thing, but certainly of the LCK. He is the final boss of domestic play. That has been proven. And then Ruler and Duro, man, was I going to bat for this bot lane a ton during the LCK regular season. And now look at them. Now everybody's praising them in terms of their MSI performance. Jokes aside, Ruler was number 1 for me going into last split, even after a rough winter. I gave Ruler MVP votes into, I think he was 3rd place for me in terms of MVP. Boy, was that an unpopular opinion. Everybody hated that. Everybody was talking about how Ruler was terrible in the spring split. Man, I just don't get it. I rewatched the tape again. I always rewatch tape going into these videos. I just don't see what people were seeing. This guy wasn't dominating the game every single time because, he's on a super team, but you know what? When he was asked to be the number 1 carry, he was arguably the most efficient one that they had in terms of how this team operated. I just don't really get it. Ruler was incredible. I guess if you just look at the stats, maybe that wasn't there. I don't know, man. The tape, absolutely, the eye test backed up that he was the number 180 carry in the LCK, and he more than proved that at MSI, where he was incredible. And then Duro, the breakout star far. Like, I had been calling this last year when he was on FearX, but even I couldn't have predicted he would have done this so quickly for Gen.G, would have become, you know, one of the best supports in the world, but he was the most productive support in the LCK last split. I think more than Delight, more than KIA, more than Lehens, Duro was the most productive support in Spring. Now, it helps that he's playing for the best team, but he was a big reason why they were the best team in terms of his playmaking and his ability to roam around the map and create numbers disadvantages. Duro was great, and while there were some concerns about his performance, you know, later on, like, he was awesome against HLE. Again, one of the players alongside Ruler that really stepped up in that series and kind of pushed Gen.G across the finish line. And was really good at MSI. Maybe not as good as Ruler and Chovy and Keen, you know, and all those other players, but still was pretty solid. Like, Gen.G is just incredible across the board. They're certainly the most consistent team across the board. They have no weaknesses. They have no places you can exploit. They have multiple play styles. They have, you know, a ridiculously high ceiling. Their floor is crazy high. They have the best player in the world. Everything is going right for Gen.G right now. Their coaching staff is incredibly talented and has been very strong at drafting throughout this year. There's just no weakness. This team doesn't go 18-0 by accident. They don't go undefeated in the spring split by accident. I don't think they're going to go undefeated in summer. I think that would be a miracle. Hell, they might even lose their first series to HLE because of the absolutely abysmal EWC tournament structure and just, you know, standing, I guess, like, schedule in terms of how things go. They have to fly all the way back to Korea and basically immediately play one of the best teams in the league. But, you know, Gen.G at peak form is the best team in the world, and right now, it's not really all that close. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK 2025 Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We went over all 10 teams and my projections for them. Of course, you know, I expect the teams at the top to do well, but you never really know in the LCK. That being said, this is one of the more predictable, if not the most predictable region in the world. The predictions for this channel have been incredibly accurate, so hopefully it ends up going according to plan. But I'm curious to know where you guys agree or disagree on either player or team placements down in the comment section below. Let me know what you're expecting out of this split and whether or not you are excited for these teams moving forward. Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions. Announcement, I am casting tonight as this video goes live for LPL English. I will be casting the 2 series again for LPL tonight, so if you're curious on that, check out the links in the description for both the Twitch and the YouTube. You can watch along if you are so curious, but we will be back doing LCK updates every single week as per usual. Hopefully every Tuesday on this channel. That's typically the LCK day, so we will be trying to get those out. But we also posted, like I said, our LPL primer, our NACL primer for the regions that already started. The LTA North and the LEC ones are going to be coming soon when those regions start to get closer and closer to starting up. But I really do appreciate it. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot to me, and hit subscribe so that you stick around for all of those other videos. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all